What's up? I'm AJ, and welcome back to Gen Z Garage. Welcome back. This is the second video in our engine removal series. If you haven't seen the first, it will be popping up in the eye right now. In this video, we're going to be removing the exhaust manifold. The tools that you will need are a breaker bar, a 9/16 and 15mm sockets, a box wrench, and an oxygen sensor socket. But before we begin, I'd like to tell you what this is from last video's trivia.
The trivia item from last video is, you guessed it, a tire pressure monitoring system sensor. In particular, this sensor came out of a 2008 Jeep Patriot 5-speed that my mom had several years ago after trading in her Volkswagen Beetle. We replaced it when we got a whole new set of tires just before a long trip. The tire pressure monitoring system was a federally mandated standard with implementation that took effect in 2005 through the passage of the Transportation Code of Federal Regulations number 49, Statute 571.138, tire pressure monitoring systems. In effect, anything manufactured after 2006 is mandated to have this system installed. It tells you the tire pressure independently of the wheel, digitally through the vehicle's dashboard. Fun fact, the TPMS uses a wireless frequency in the range of 314 to 440 MHz and is activated with a low frequency 125 kHz radio signal. This can be easily hacked using a software-defined radio to receive and a digital device such as the Hack RF to perform what is known as a replay attack. This allows you to record, modify, and send back false signals to the TPMS receiver. This can result in auto-inflating truck tires to explode while on the highway, or in a best-case scenario, a misreading of the tire pressure. Once again, TurboSlug wins the trivia as being the first one to correctly answer the question. Congratulations to TurboSlug! We'll start the removal process by bending back the exhaust manifold retaining tabs. These tabs are part of small brackets that mount between the exhaust manifold flange and the exhaust manifold bolt. They have little tabs that are bent inwards to press up against the exhaust bolt. These tabs ensure that the exhaust bolts do not back out during the heating and cooling cycles of the engine. These are hard to find, and I definitely want to reuse these, so I'll take great care when bending them back. I bend them back just enough with a dull flathead screwdriver so I can work the flat part of my hammer and dolly set. I use the dolly to help pound down the tabs. As I said, work slowly so that you do not damage these. You only need to bend them far enough so that you can get the socket in there. If you damage them and need replacements, you can no longer buy the originals. However, there are aftermarket clips that you can purchase for Pontiac small block engines. With the tabs out of the way, we'll move on to other parts of the manifold before we remove the bolts. We start by removing the cylinder head coolant temperature sensor and setting it off to the side. Next, we'll remove the oxygen sensor connector. The connector clip is damaged, so we'll need to replace this end at some point anyway. We've already disconnected the battery and the spark plugs from a previous episode, so there's nothing left on this side for us to disconnect. Next, we'll remove the oxygen sensor. I first spray a little bit of PP Blaster at the seam to help break it loose. I then use a crescent wrench to break it free until I can unscrew it with my hands. Note, if you plan to reuse this sensor, be careful when removing it so that you do not damage the sensor's end. It's advisable to put it in a clean Ziploc bag when you remove it. I'll be replacing it with a new Delphi unit, but I'll keep this as a spare. We can now begin removing the exhaust bolts. I'll start off by using a breaker bar to break the bolts loose first. There are 3 bolts on top and 4 bolts on the bottom. All of them are easily accessible, so no body contortion is necessary. Although I'm using a breaker bar, I am working the bolts very carefully and slowly. Depending on how much rust you might have back here, it's advisable to just work slowly. These are prone to breaking, and the last thing you want to have to deal with is drilling out a snapped bolt. With all the bolts loose, I remove them by hand if I'm able, and begin placing them into the metal magnetic dish. As with everything else, I'll be bagging and tagging these bolts and putting them in my parts box. Realistically, I will probably replace these bolts, but it's still a good idea to keep track of everything, even if you don't plan to use them. For the more stubborn bolts, I switch to a large socket wrench to remove them one at a time. Again, I'm still removing them slowly and carefully as I do not want them to break off in the cylinder head. Unfortunately, the two spring bolts that hold the manifold to the header pipe are seized and very rusty. I cannot get a socket firmly on them enough to remove them without potentially damaging something in the engine bay. I knew this ahead of time, so I'm going to be cutting the manifold out from underneath, so under the car I go. While I jack up the rear of the car, I'll talk about what I plan to do. An original Fiero uses the older pellet style of catalytic converter. These converters were often filled with pellets and worked fairly decent at times, but they are somewhat less efficient and typically lose their post-combustion catalyst ability over time. I'll be replacing mine with a brand new Ocelot converter from the Fiero store. With this in mind, I don't mind cutting out the converter, which will allow me to remove the manifold and header pipe from the engine bay. Before I get under the car, I place a set of jacks under the frame on both the left and the right side. I've also placed rubber wheel chocks in front of the front wheels so the car won't rock forward. I use a corded sawzall with a metal cutting plate. The tool is heavy, so my dad is helping me by holding it to make sure I don't injure myself. It is always important when working with tools like this, make sure you use both hearing protection and eye protection. Also, make sure your hair is in a ponytail and out of the way. As I mentioned before, I'll cut just before the catalytic converter as I do not want to damage the actual header pipe. It may look bad, but the Fiero's exhaust is actually a lower quality stainless, and it's even mandrel bent. After a little bit of cutting, the exhaust breaks free.
Done. Alright, lean back.
I remove the exhaust retention spring while I'm under, and then lower the car back down onto its wheels. I can now carefully fish the exhaust manifold and header pipe out as one unit. I lay out the manifold and header pipe and begin cutting the bolts. I intend to save at least the header pipe, and I might reuse the exhaust manifold too, so I'm careful not to damage either of these when cutting the bolts loose. Whoa, let's see that again. I then flip the manifold and pipe and cut the other bolt loose.
Thanks for watching. In this video, we removed the exhaust manifold, which was definitely, without a doubt, exhausting. Get it? Get it? Like exhausting? I'm so funny, I know. Anyway, make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see the next video whenever it comes out and whenever it'll be on. And before you go, I would like you to tell me what you think this is in the comment section below. Thank you and have a wonderful day. But first, it is time for celebratory candy corn. Have those cabinets always been there?